many more things under his sleeve, so hopefully we get to hear the whole medley. Welcome, Erkki.
Thank you. Thank you. So I was informed in time that it's not going to be an announced public lecture, so I did my best not to write anything. So just what I'm just simply trying to do is to give you an idea about the couple of fields that I've been working on during these, let's say, maybe past 15 years or so. And I think it will get clear quite soon that I was one of those people who never probably was able to make very strict decisions about concentrating on just one kind of things and throwing all the others aside. So for years I found myself trying to push along various lines, sometimes and actually more and more often interlocking, meeting each other, but still applying quite a few different media for these purposes. So I'll try to give you a couple of glimpses of that kind of activity I have been involved in these past few years. So to say a couple of words about my background, which I think is always useful to help you understand some of these things. On the one hand, it's in cultural history, studies in cultural history and art history, actually quite a long time ago already. But during those years at the university in Finland, I was very actively involved with the different issues around audiovisual culture at that time. So actually starting from film, I was one of those film buffs who spent maybe about 6 nights a week in the cinema in the 70s in Finland, which was a wonderful time of seeing films from both East and West. So I could probably say that by the time I was about 17 or 18, I had a fairly good education in classical cinema. And actually one really memorable event took place, I think when I was probably about 15 or 16. Also back in Finland, I somehow got aware about a very special screening which was supposed to take place in the city, the fairly small city in which I was living at that time. An old French person, old man, so I actually still remember his features, was touring with a very extraordinary film show, which actually showed films by his grandfather. So the name of this old man already at that point was Jean Méliès, and his grandfather was Georges Méliès. So when I was about 16, I had this chance of seeing a wonderful collection of hand-colored prints by early trick and animation films by Georges Méliès, one of the great masters of early cinema. And I like to think that, now that I think about it after so many years, that this was one of those moments which somehow was kind of decisive in my interest. So from the point of view of my future interests, so like focusing me on ideas which deal with not so much with anything mainstream, but sort of like creative applications of audiovisual media. And probably that path led me then in the 80s to issues around video art, different forms, other forms of using video, also music videos, about which I did some research a long time ago. And also then in the second half of the, towards the end of the 80s, to the field of computer imaging, computers as a potential medium at that time for a new kind of a moving image culture. So which is pretty much the beginning of one side of my work, which was this activity as a curator and producer of artwork, mostly in connection with the computing culture. So it's been one of those, definitely one of those guiding lines during these past 10 years. So I've done should I say, many, probably many exhibitions. I think something like 12 to 14 exhibitions in Finland, but also in other countries. I did actually one show even in the Los Angeles area in 95, I think, at the art gallery at the Pasadena Art Center Gallery, which was a group show of interactive installation art. And I was also involved with organizing a large-scale festival of new computer sort of like related art for Los Angeles in actually 94 and 95, an event called the Interactive Media Festival, which took place at the Variety Arts in downtown Los Angeles. So I was one of the people actually working on that and realizing that event. Actually, as an interesting aside, so maybe I should mention that this event, which took place in 95, was probably the first art event which took simultaneously place in the internet. So using the very earliest versions of the VRML code. So we had a virtual gallery about what was actually to be seen, a virtual kind of like a duplicate, which was actually available in the internet at that time, and probably was the very first of its kind ever designed. So beside this activity, and I would actually like to just in a second show you a couple of slides. This is pretty much a random selection of slides over the years, showing you just a glimpse of the work of a couple of artists whose work has been included in these shows that I've curated. I would just like to say before going into that, so that a couple of words about this other side of my activity, which has also always pulled me towards looking at questions of media culture also in this historical focus, trying to understand these things not only in the present but also somehow mirroring them through phenomena we find from earlier centuries. I'll just show you a couple of images which have kind of developed, have kind of began kind of key images for my teaching and research over the years. I think this often happens with many people doing the kind of work. So once you're doing research and you're entering different fields, so then you find yourself in your thoughts and very often in your lectures coming back to a certain kind of image which provides a sort of like entry point for you to those fields. And I think this is definitely has been probably the most important key image for my research. This is a cartoon from 1911 from the Life magazine, which is not the famous Life, but actually the earlier magazine with the same name. It's a cartoon by Harry Grant Dart, who actually published quite a few such visions about future. Very often, as so much of the science fiction discourse, kind of like situated in a strange temporal dimension between the present and the future, somewhere there, which shows us a world sort of like inhabited by all these amazing technologies, and tries to deal with the role of the human in relation to those technologies. I'm not going to go through all these different gadgets we see around here, maybe just pointing out a couple of interesting devices like this thing that this fantasy machine right here, which seems to have some kind of a personal device into sort of like a television device to seeing into a distance, and which has some kind of a customized sort of like bookmarks list, if you want, for webcams or whatever how you want to take it. So it's kind of fantasy for that kind of a form of communication. At the same time, it's a device which obviously has something to do with the technologies of surveillance, so like peeping at people from behind their backs and things like that. But actually the things which really started interesting me when I first found this image had to do with the kind of vision about the fate of humans in the era, shall we say, on the era of the integrated media technology. So the fact so I mean that when we look at the kind of vision, not just this vision, but many other visions from the beginning of the 20th century, we see that obviously the impact of this accumulation of all these fantastic technologies has been a certain kind of like breaking down of the social units, like family type of social unit, which actually puts it into a situation where the communication is actually mediated, taking place by means of these technologies in distance, and leaves people alone in their places, surrounded by these sort of like these gadgets and things like that. We could actually, and I often do in my teaching and writing, I often contrast this vision with some of the earlier ideas from the Victorian era, which were kind of reactions to the first media machines ever introduced to the homes, which were devices like the stereoscope or the phonograph in the 1870s, which often showed us a much more positive vision, like these media devices like surrounding or strengthening these basic social units, still situated in just this one and the same space within the home, often actually around the table, or in some cases sitting around the fireplace and things like that. So when I started thinking about visual discourses like the one we see here, it was actually almost impossible at that time to come to think about thinkers like European apocalyptic media thinkers like Jean Baudrillard, who seem to be claiming that the main impact of this integrated media technology, actually basically pretty much taking place in the situation in the 70s and 80s, was this fact of like turning private spaces into sort of like satellite spaces, and also kind of breaking basic units in society, culture, as a result of the introduction of these technologies and the kind of formation of a kind of a technological zone surrounding these people. So, I mean, I found it interesting that the kind of research, kind of philosophy, which seemed to be talking about the present in the situation, let's say in these 80s, or could pretty much be applied to the 90s as well, was possible to find in these popular manifestations like decades earlier, and as I soon found out, actually much earlier than this. So I found ways of, as I continued this kind of research, this is, by the way, an image illustrating the other situation I referred to, where you see that the coming of the media technology, which is this simple device for viewing these images, seems to, according to these visual discourses, seems to have this sort of like unifying effect, like creating harmony. On the other hand, of course, we see a kind of like a dreamy-like aspect entering culture, like people spending time together, but at the same time somehow probably being immersed in these visual worlds opened up by this media technology you're seeing right there. But I wanted to show you still another image which I personally found interesting when I continued the kind of research that I'm trying to explain. And the kind of image is the one here. Like looking at these very early devices, which until recently haven't even been considered worthy of the name of media. They were actually considered, until about maybe 10 years ago, mostly less like simple optical toys in the 19th century, which had nothing to do with the kind of functions that media came to serve in the 20th century. like the stereo viewer. But if we look at this kind of visual discourses around it, like this is from the 1860s, the beginning around 1860, so it probably shows us certain features of culture which we easily easily identify with much later stages, like this device entering the home, almost like father carrying home the first TV set in the maybe in the 1950s. Everybody showing like being so enthusiastic about it. It's actually showing the former forms of pastime, like reading books and things. Then what happens is that this appearance of this device starts breaking the family unit somehow. First, all kind of incident starts happening. Children get immersed in this device, and finally we see this outcome of the introduction of the media, which is like a group of wrecks, with cross-eyed wrecks. The kind of lifestyle has been completely ruined by this technology. I mean, I don't think I need to remind anyone about the kind of pedagogical discourses, ideological discourses around television at the time in the 50s, or more recently in the context of the internet. But just to show you that I became very interested in looking at different manifestations and interpretations of media in the past, also in the context of our contemporary notions of that, also in the sense of trying to understand better what's the direction, what's the dimension of novelty that's so often touted by advertisers and people like that. Everything is unheard of in culture, that kind of things. Now we find ways of peeling away a lot of this kind of apparent novelty, and probably it will, I think, give us better understanding about really what's this sort of like the developing, what are the developing layers and features in culture in these days. I never wanted to say that, I never wanted to feel, I never felt I'm a nostalgic, so I always wanted to dive into the past to look at the ways how these let us understand those processes that pretty much active in the structures in media culture. This is a topic that I always get carried with, so it usually, I find it very difficult to stop at some point, so somebody should just take away these images from me. But let's say part of my research has been trying to locate forgotten technologies, devices which seem to be completely obsolete, that nobody's even talking about, and then trying to understand their role in this general fabric of media culture. One of these devices I encountered, and I'll let this be the absolutely last example, so because the time is running, was, for instance, this device, which was actually the very first device which mechanized the process of writing. This was Edison's invention from the 1870s, which was Edison electric pen and press. Very weird type of media device, using, as you can see, using a very simple sort of like electric battery and tiny little electric motor in the end of the pen. And now the principle with which this device works is pretty much the same as the sewing machine. So there's actually there isn't any ink in the end of the pen. There's actually like a puncturing needle. And now what you do, you actually puncture, the secretary actually punctures a paper which looks pretty much like this. And then this is used with a more traditional, like printing press, like a device to produce copies of that. And Edison actually claimed that up to 4,000 copies could be produced out of each matrix, basically, produced with this device here. Now, of course, this is a device which was very widely used in American offices for a while. It was actually became really part of the technological landscape on Wall Street, everywhere in the 1870s. And almost as rapidly it was gone. Naturally, it was replaced by devices like the typewriter, which was introduced just a little bit after this device here. Now, of course, we understand why Edison came up with this idea. As so often in culture, so the pen, naturally, as the most natural interface for writing or drawing, was the kind of idea which is behind it. This is self-evident. On the other hand, Edison was one of the pioneers of electric technology, so he wanted to expand his markets and find new applications for devices like that. On the other hand, I think it's really interesting to try to look at issues around interfacing ideas like using the pen. And then if we look at, once again, media, cultural, material, from such a point of view, I think some of the traditional ideas may kind of like reorganize themselves differently from what we've been thinking about. For instance, thinking about one of the basic apparata of media culture, audiovisual media culture, which is the camera obscura, which you all know, which is in a sense the preform of any of the cameras we worked with these days. In one of its early functions, it was seen as an artist's tool. This is a long story. I can't go into this actually here. Something pretty much related with the Renaissance theories of perspective at the time in the 17th century and the 18th century, used by artists for producing sketches. The light beams enter through the lens, bounce from the mirror, and end up on this transparent screen right here. But so if we look at devices like this now from a slightly different point of view, thinking about the kind of interfaces, so then we can actually probably see some kind of an interesting connection with this idea and let's say the idea that we just talked about from the 1870s, thinking about the fact that this is another pen-based screen. It's a screen which we're actually touching with the tip of the pen for the purpose of sketching, producing an image. Now this is basically simple, of course, but if we think about the kind of situations these days where we communicate with screens by means of touching with some kind of a pointing device and touching it with that, so then I think we come to think about interactive screens, we come to think about tablets. I've been using a Wacom tablet actually instead of a mouse for quite some time. For instance, I found it much more natural, actually even for writing and anything, so natural interface than some other things. We could also look at, interestingly, issues like the interplay of this kind of a interface in history with the other alternative, which is the keyboard-based idea, which appears, for instance, with the typewriter in the late 19th century. And then we could probably also consider devices like that, and I'm just going to show you this image, like some early telegraph devices. This is actually was very widely used form of the telegraph, introduced in the 1850s by this guy. This is called the so-called Hughes machine, which was like a way of like playing, as almost like music, playing the messages over distances, using the kind of piano keyboard. Or we could look at the automata tradition, so the very early playful examples of like playing with this kind of creating like technologies which raised issues around media culture, like these writing automata or piano playing automata, things like that. So this is just to give you an idea about the kind of things that I've been trying to explore during the past 10 years. And of course you see that one of the reasons why I'm doing this is that I am trying to understand also the contemporary logic of these interfaces. Why do we use certain kind of interfaces to connect us with these technologies and the worlds beyond those? I think that one of the ways we can answer is really to look at these historical manifestations of those and actually see some kind of a historical fluctuation in these ideas. I think that there are many ideas which are basically there in this like historical traces we can still find, and which we can very interestingly connect with our more recent ideas. And I personally would like to say that always felt teaching, actually having a fairly long experience in teaching institutions which have to do with design and media. University of Art and Design in Helsinki, and actually the University of Lapland, where I was the chair for such a program, actually for a while, like some media studies program. So that I've come to feel that this kind of approach probably seems to provide a more wider, so like understanding for people trying to cope with certain kind of basic media related design issues. It gives them a sort of like understanding about the background and the cultural sort of like cultural context of the kind of things that they are trying to do. Because I'm thinking that people are often seem to be sort of like having absolutely no idea about certain kind of functions in their lives and their professional activities. They're just doing things like that. So pretty much all of my work, in some sense, over these past 10 years, has been about trying to provide these contexts for these young people, to make them more conscious about what they are doing, to give them the possibility of using this incredible richness of this historical material, much of which is totally forgotten, to kind of like enrich the kind of things that they are trying to do. So this is pretty much, to put it very, very briefly, what's been a sort of like a guiding line in these things. Now, we have a little bit of time. Let's see quickly, very quickly, those slides can we see the slides quickly? And I'm just like to, I want to show this very briefly, and then I want to show you a brief fragment of one of my TV series in which I tried to use the television to actually visualize some of these ideas that I've been doing. So, okay. This is actually, yeah, thank you. So this is, I'm not going to analyze this here. So that I think there are other occasions to talk about these. Just to show you a very random selection of a couple of these artworks that I've been showing in various different kind of exhibition contexts. I could actually add quite a few things like work by Bill Seaman. I didn't have a slide with me. Just this is a Geoffrey Shaw's classic, I would say almost like a classic installation called Legible City, probably one of the basic works dealing with issues around interactive media and its problematics. So the kind of cycling tour within this virtual city on the screen. I showed this in the beginning of the 90s in an interactive art exhibition in Helsinki. This was made, I think, in '89. This is actually one just showing another view. There are different sort of like virtual cities of letters within these worlds, and while you're sort of cycling through the world here, what you're actually doing is turned interestingly into a process of reading by the fact that you actually cycling from one sentence to another, and also in some sense to an idea of act of writing, because basically being able to choose your routes here, so you're not just reading, but you're leaving a trace behind. It's kind of like conceptual trace of the kind of sentences you went through. In a way, it's also a metaphor for a sort of like multi-dimensional database, of course, language database, and which I think I've been, some of my writings connecting with some ideas about 20s and 30s poetry switchers and Dadaist poetry ideas, abandoning the existing syntaxes of language and trying to find ways of actually touring inside the language. There would be much more to say about this, but I will say at some other point. This is just a map for one of those worlds. One of them is actually based on the idea of Manhattan. This is an example of a very early interactive installation I showed in the late 80s. This is Lynn Hirschman's Lorna, which was one of the early pieces using the then new video disc technology. I think Bill Seaman was also experimenting with this at about the same time at MIT. But sort of like creating a kind of a personality and a sort of like psychiatric session by means of like using a computer stack and the video disc. This is from another Lynn Hirschman video disc called Deep Contact, about some erotic narratives, also using the same technology from the 80s. I showed this in the beginning of the 90s in one of the big shows in Helsinki. This is another of her work, which is like a peep show box, again referring to very early technologies, which is popping up over and over again as we look at the history of the media culture. What you see inside there, how do you sharpen? Okay, let's see. What you see inside there is actually this miniature room, and the eyepiece is a kind of a sort of like visual joystick. So you activate certain parts of the space, and what happens is you trigger, I'm sorry, these are the wrong way around, trigger video sequences in the back, which confront you directly, which is a very clever, interesting way of like criticizing certain like scopic issues which had to do with the traditional ideas around the peep show machine, which is pretty much a like voyeuristic situation where you are in the situation of power. You are commanding the situation of looking into the visual field, where she introduced elements which actually kind of like countered that kind of ideas, like these images challenging you directly, or actually or your own image as a video loop in the tiny little monitor there. I'm sorry about this. I usually speak at much longer about this. This is a very simple example of the work of Perry Hoberman, the New York-based artist. It's a suitcase turned into a kind of a strange stereo view. So there's a whole world, illuminated world inside the suitcase. It's called Excess Luggage. A couple of years ago, I curated a large-scale retrospective show of Perry Hoberman, which was seen at the Center for Art and Media Technology in Karlsruhe, Germany, and also in Finland. And we also produced a large-scale catalog for that. This was actually just one of the pieces in that show. Or pieces like Catherine Richards' The Virtual Body, which I found actually interesting, where she was also dealing with ideas about peeping into boxes, which is a very traditional media form, but actually criticizing the fact, like introducing the second hole through which you can insert your hand inside the box. So now this means partly introducing your body into that visual field, which we traditionally associate as a virtual space which cannot be entered by the body, which can only be entered by your eye. So she wanted to enter and criticize those ideas by, interestingly, making you see not just the virtual world inside the box, but actually your hand actually manipulating the image world in it. And now this is the traditional reference point to all those works. This is an early 18th century peep show machine from the collection of the Film Museum in Turin in Italy, which is one of the most wonderful collections in the world. And this technology, which has been pretty much forgotten, is quite interestingly kind of being brought back to view, let's say, by this tradition of these artists. I just showed a couple of examples. On the other hand, the peep show idea is something which is pretty much present in the media culture these days. You just think about any of those notorious sex sites on the internet and the way how they are designed. The logic you find there, where you have to click and click and click, you are given all those promises. Finally, the door closes unless you give your credit card number or whatever. This is exactly the kind of logic which we find from these marketplaces in the 18th century, almost word to word, in the context of these cultures. Cultures, machines made out of wood, simple paper illusions inside, but something which is in some very meaningful way, I think, connected with the kind of experiences we encounter on the web these days. Now, I'm just trying to say, and this is the last thing I want to say, that this is the complete explanation for all the questions and problems and issues on the web. It's definitely not. But it's one possible way of approaching and sort of like opening up some of the design issues there from a historical perspective, which I still claim is an important, interesting one. This is, by the way, another of those wonderful peep show boxes preserved at the Museum of Turin, which is pretty interesting in many ways. For instance, this is for 5 people, so in a marketplace. It tells you something important about the culture, for instance, in the sense that if you try to accommodate 5 people in front of this machine, and we have made the experiment in Torino, so you necessarily you are cheek to cheek. So it's something which had to do with the idea of the diseases spreading in culture in the 18th century through the marketplaces, encounters of people there, and which somehow affected the bad image of this kind of technology in culture, because it was associated with spreading diseases. And this is exactly the kind of theme which was taken up also actually in the case of the very earliest movie theaters in the beginning of the 20th century. People were told not to go because these are places where diseases is spread, because it brings together people that never ever in their daily lives would get so close to each other otherwise. So we can actually find all these explanations and things communicated through this. No, I don't know how this would connect with the idea of like internet peep shows and some kind of cyber diseases spread by those, but I mean that's up to others to think about. And this is actually just a wonderful text in the cover, the original text saying, Insta casella mostro il mondo nuovo con dentro lontananze prospettive, voglio un soldo per testa e che lo trovo. Basically saying, in this box I'm showing you the new world, the distant lands, the perspective views, and I want to have a coin for from each of you, things like that. I think I will actually, I have a couple of things, but let's stop the slides now. I think this is enough to give you an idea about the kind of approaches I have had. So would you have like a couple of minutes more so that I could show you a little fragment of one of my TV works, because I've been very interested in applying all different media into talking about these kind of ideas, to making them public and understandable. So I was never interested only to publish scientific papers and books. And in a sense, I also see part of my exhibition activity as another medium. So, and television has been another medium for me as well. So I have written and directed a couple of television series raising issues around media, interfaces, culture during the 90s. And these have been actually fairly widely shown. Never in the States, but some of them have been shown in different countries in Europe. And I've also written like companion books for this. And I think probably the most ambitious, so I did one in Japan in 93, 94 about Japanese media culture. And before that, there was one which was about virtual reality. During these earliest times, it was 91. And then 96, I finished after working for 2 years or so, a fairly ambitious TV series which is called The Archaeology of the Moving Image, which is a kind of a history from a media archaeological point of view, a kind of history of all these audiovisual technologies from the 16th century to the beginning of the 20th century. And I also wrote a companion book, which is a kind of a history of these technologies. Unfortunately, at the moment, only available in Finnish, but people keep suggesting that I should produce an English version of this. I wouldn't like to. It's 5 years, so I should rewrite it completely, but maybe it's an idea. I'll show you just a brief sequence from the first part of this, which deals with the ideas of projection, culture of projection, magic lantern culture, and the kind of topics related with that. So let's see this short sequence.
Lantern. Camera obscura, elle apparaît au XIIIe siècle, ce qui est quand même déjà très ancien. Mais c'est-à-dire qu'on l'a utilisé au début pour observer des éclipses, etc. C'est à la Renaissance qu'on a commencé à capter, avec cette chambre noire, les images de la vie quotidienne et éventuellement des images même mises en scène. La lanterne magique est venue après, bien sûr, la chambre noire, mais on ne sait pas exactement à quelle date. On sait qu'elle est apparue brusquement, je dirais, aux Pays-Bas, entre les mains d'un astronome à l'époque extrêmement réputé qui s'appelait Christian Huygens. Et Huygens en 1659, a dessiné la première plaque connue de lanterne magique. Donc en plus c'était une plaque animée déjà, c'était un squelette qui retirait son crâne et qui le remettait sur ses épaules. C'était une transcription de la danse de mort de Hans Holbein.
The lantern, in its long career, went through many phases. When it began, it was the discovery of and the pleasure, the toy of scientists, and its first home was in the scientific cabinets, the cabinets of curiosities of 17th and 18th century savants, along with microscopes and telescopes and other marvels of the age. But it was too amusing to be left just to the scholars and the scientists, and it was quickly taken up by showmen. Throughout the 18th century, travelling showmen, they would travel with their lanterns on their backs and their boxes of glass slides and perhaps a hurdy-gurdy or some other form of musical instrument. And they would travel from place to place, and they came to a village, they would give shows, maybe in a barn, or if they were very lucky they might get into the drawing room of the grand house.
Je pense qu'au XVIIIe siècle, les colporteurs de lanternes magiques ou de boîtes optiques étaient beaucoup les médias ambulants du siècle. Les gens n'avaient pas évidemment de radio, de télévision, les journaux n'arrivaient pas dans les campagnes. Et le colporteur qui allait de village en village, avec soit sa lanterne magique et ses plaques, soit ses vues d'optique dans ces boîtes optiques, permettait de raconter à toute la campagne, à tous les gens reculés, ce qui pouvait se passer à la cour, ce qui pouvait se passer dans le monde, pouvait leur montrer des monuments des grandes villes d'Europe. Et c'était vraiment un média important pour le peuple. La fantasmagorie est apparue à la fin du XVIIIe siècle, sous la Révolution française, à travers un homme qui s'appelait Robertson. Il a créé des plaques de lanternes magiques qui étaient très inquiétantes, qui étaient à base de squelettes, à base de revenants, à base de fantômes. Il a utilisé, alors que Louis XVI et Marie-Antoinette venaient d'être guillotinés quelques années avant, il a, ainsi que d'autres révolutionnaires comme Danton ou Robespierre, il projetait dans un endroit un peu inquiétant, dans un couvent, avec des lanternes magiques qui, pour la première fois, étaient mobiles.
Un Français, en parlant de la lanterne Huygens, a dit « c'est la lanterne de peur ». Ça dit bien, ça désigne exactement ce que représentait la lanterne magique aux yeux des gens qui n'arrivaient pas à s'expliquer la façon dont elle marchait. La fantasmagorie est revenue comme ça et pour évoquer les morts, pour faire peur, à une époque vraiment scientifique, à une époque sensée. Donc ça, c'est encore un paradoxe assez intéressant. On a longtemps cru que la fantasmagorie avait été inventée par Étienne Gaspard Robert, dit Robertson. En fait, il n'en est absolument rien. Robertson a été une sorte de semi-charlatan, de voleur. Il a emprunté tous les procédés à des personnages qui, bien avant lui, avaient déjà mis en œuvre le spectacle de fantasmagorie. Alors, le spectacle de fantasmagorie, c'est avant tout, c'est la rétroprojection. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne voit pas la lanterne magique, elle est cachée derrière l'écran, et les images deviennent véritablement mobiles et animées. Elles sont animées par toujours les mouvements classiques, comme pour la plaque de Huygens, mais les images évoluent, deviennent de plus en plus grandes ou de plus en plus petites, etc., puisque la lanterne fantascope est montée sur des rails.
Alors là, vous avez une lanterne de fantasmagorie qui date des années 1840-50, qui rentre entièrement dans cette boîte. Quand on la démonte, l'objectif étant très lourd et soutenu par ce berceau en bois, et vous avez la possibilité soit de passer des plaques, toujours évidemment avec des têtes un peu grotesques, avec donc de passer des plaques soit horizontalement, donc comme beaucoup de lanternes, avec l'objectif devant, soit vous pouvez passer, ce qui est beaucoup plus rare, des plaques verticalement, et qui rentrent de cette façon-là dans la lanterne magique. Et donc elle passe de cette façon-là, et vous avez bien évidemment, comme sur toute lanterne de fantasmagorie, la manivelle pour l'éloignement ou le rapprochement, et la ficelle pour l'œil de chat dans l'objectif. Et tout ça a fait un spectacle qui a connu un succès immense très rapidement, qui a été copié, bien évidemment, comme tout ce qui marche, et jusqu'aux années 1810-1815, des spectacles de fantasmagorie ont tourné comme ça, à Paris, et puis après en province ou même à l'étranger. Et on trouve d'ailleurs des objets, des lanternes de fantasmagorie sur les catalogues jusqu'aux alentours de 1840-50 à peu près. Ce qui prouve qu'il devait encore y avoir des spectacles dans ces eaux-là.
Pendant tout le 19e siècle, on a toujours exploité la veine de la fantasmagorie, des projections diaboliques, etc. Et c'est vrai que dès l'apparition du cinéma, finalement, on assiste encore à des résurgences de la fantasmagorie. Emile Cole va réaliser un film qui s'appelle Fantasmagorie. Les Anglais vont réaliser des films, des skeleton dances, des choses comme ça où on voit des petits squelettes qui dansent, etc. Toujours dans la tradition, finalement, que Huygens a débuté, a commencé.
Poi appunto c'è stato l'abate Nollet che ha pensato ma perché non utilizzare la lanterna magica non solo a scopo di divertimento per far vedere paesaggi, scene.
So I think we probably wouldn't have more time actually to continue with this, but when this was actually in some sense it was a strange one-man television within the framework of a big TV company. So I wrote a script, I directed it, I went around the crew. This was shot in Italy, England, Germany, France, Holland, this whole series. Nothing in Finland, there's nothing. And so went through for actually for quite a few shooting days, and then basically even the visual, I did the editing, so took the whole editing together with the, of course, with the online editor, and even designing the graphic sort of like nature of the work. And I was actually very ambitious with this series, so I wanted it to be, in some sense, very concrete. So it has to be able to tell the visitors really about how these many cases forgotten technologies worked. I wanted it to make extremely sort of like clear. At the same time, I tried to speak about the culture, these cultural connections behind all these things. Whether it succeeded, I don't know. But anyway, so that was I tried to balance between this concreteness and the kind of general vision of culture. So this is in actually 1.5 hours altogether, and I'm thinking about trying to somehow do it again. So like actually to make 1 or 2 parts more, as I learned so many things after I realized this series. So I think this is pretty much it. So that I'm working on a new TV idea, which would be pretty much be about sort of like a mental cultural history of the early computing. It's actually a jump to a slightly different direction. So using a lot of archival footage from the 50s and 60s about how the computer was received in culture, which is amazingly pretty much unexplored area. So we have some books about the history of the computing hardware and software, but we have very few explanations and understanding about the role of the culture in popular imaginations, people's minds and things. So I've actually submitted a script for this thing. Let's see if at some point in the distant future I would get the production budget together. But I think it's also something which might be needed. So maybe that could be some future TV work. About other research interests I have now is that I think that probably I've come to a point where I should gather together all this research that's been published in different sources. That's at least the impact I get from the feedback I get from people. So I think it's probably time to produce the book on media archaeology, which bringing all these things together. And the other thing I think should be a kind of like a book about the history of interactive art, which really doesn't exist either. So also connecting that with like pre-digital ideas on the field of on this field, which I touched upon a little bit in this lecture. I think those 2 books are probably the most urgent ones to write, and I think I probably should. I mean, when it comes to writing, so I should concentrate on those to get those two things done. I think this is probably all. I may have forgotten something. Yeah.
So from the work you show, you seem to have an interest both in the mechanisms of these devices, and you spend a lot of time in how they work and the design of the hardware in a sense. And then I guess I understand the curating side is the interest in the content.
Yes, I think it's probably, I wouldn't say these are so separate from each other, but I mean, I definitely think that, I mean, that as I think was clear, I'm very interested in, always been very interested in the discourses surrounding technology. I don't see technologies like hardware or software as separate from these cultural contexts ever surrounding them. And so that it's been my great interest to try to understand this cultural context, the kind of visions and fears, sometimes some hopes and whatever, all kinds of like ideas people attach to these technologies and which surround them in culture. This is definitely one. But I also think that it's very important to look closely at certain features of these technologies themselves. Because I think that these technologies themselves are like design solutions. If you think about interfaces or the ways these things function, they tell us much about this culture as well. So I think we should focus on those things as well. So I think that in some sense we can also, this is debatable actually, in some sense we can also look at that kind of design solutions in those machines themselves as kind of discourses. It's a kind of a statement about how certain things function. And very often certain features of these technologies, if we just think about the hardware, pretty much affect the aesthetics and the nature of the spectacle, and then also the nature of this impact it has in society. We can think about simple pieces of technology like the Lumiere cinematograph, one of the first movie cameras, for instance, which was directly connected with the kind of aesthetics produced for those early movie audiences by the fact that it had no viewfinder, you had no ways of moving it, so you had to actually set it up looking through the lens, put the film inside, close it, and you had no way of actually panning with the camera. That's one of the reasons why all the early films contain no film movements. So it's partly the function of the technology.
Yeah.
At the same time, it of course has to do with the fact that the model in people's minds was photography. And photography always, I mean, one of the things which is naturally connected with that is that the camera by any means shouldn't move. You have to keep the camera stable. So that's kind of thinking like came over from the field of photography to the early moving image culture, and it took a while until this technology changed and people's aesthetics changed and made the camera mobile.
And as a curator, your interest is in looking at art. Is it in general looking at artists that are working with new media technologies, or do you find yourself drawn to certain types of areas of art?
No, actually, this was a unfortunately very narrow selection of work. So, and this was pretty much. I can confess that I had this because this had to do with some of the classes I'm doing. So
Yeah.
with these media archaeological connections. But I definitely wouldn't say that I'm only showing work which deals with these ideas. I'm definitely interested in all kinds of different kinds of approaches. But I mean that
But all relating to media and somehow?
You mean that so that this leads us to the
I mean, do you
complicated question,
curate-
what we mean by media?
Are you,
So-
as a curator, are you looking at art, are you kind of looking at the latest trend, like, you know, now internet and art seems to be such an interest, so do you feel that it's your responsibility to look at that?
I think there are many people trying to do it, so there are many people running after fashion, so to say. I'm not interested in that, so I'm much more interested in taking sort of like more conceptual approach, taking certain ideas which I think probably artists have been raising, and then and using that as a guiding line in the exhibition. I don't want to do things like interactive exhibitions of interactive art, something like that ever again. I did several of those in the times when this technology was new and sort of like upcoming, and it was kind of interesting. But I think it's around. It's very widely used. I think it's much more interesting to adapt the sort of like conceptual, content-oriented point of view for curating. So I did it myself, you know, but I wouldn't like to do it again. And so this is the direction. But I mean this means that this kind of approach can accommodate very many different kinds of ways of using artistic means. And like already in the most recent one I curated, I have all kinds of things, like starting from mosaic works, pieces which are traditional floor mosaics. Directly it has nothing to do with the computer, but if you start thinking about all the connections, and for instance in the context of that particular piece, it's pretty much about contemporary culture, it's pretty much about media. At the same time it makes all these cultural references all the way back to the imperial palaces in ancient Rome or early Christian churches. It's actually a floor mosaic showing a giant image of Lara Croft, the computer image, computer game heroine these days. Of course, the idea of mosaic is always directly associated with the pixel image, the nature of the computer image and all that kind of things. So I wouldn't like to, at least anymore, use a certain technological tool as the deciding factor for any exhibition I do. I think it should be subordinated to the ideas and concepts.
Can you talk a little bit about the shifting relationship between artists and curators? Or if you see a relationship shifting?
Yeah. I mean, this whole question that, as far as I know, there doesn't seem to be something like the theory of the curator. It's also interesting that if one looks at some of these more serious analyses about the systems of the art world, you know, what are the decisive relationships within the art world and that are naturally interacting with each other. I'm thinking about some writings by Martha Rosler, for instance, her like late 70s and 80s writings where she tried to look at all these different factors like gallery, critique, whatever. So actually the curator wasn't part of that thinking, which is in itself, I think it's quite interesting. So I think that it seems to me that the role, first of all, that the role of the curator, which is of course comes from the curator, it's a keeper of collections in traditional museums, has actually undergone some changes recently. I think you are right. Now, it's also interesting to think about this question that you just made. So how do the curators relate to the artists themselves? How do they see themselves, and how this relationship between these has been shifting? So I can probably only answer, and I'll try to answer just briefly from my own personal point of view. I personally feel that on this field, the role of the curator somehow has, at least in some cases, seemed to at some. First of all, it's partly resembles something which could be labeled as producer, partly. So producing work, helping sometimes fund work, maybe somehow commenting on the progress of the work and things like that. I've been a couple of times in such role. Some work by Paul Sermon, these telematic installations we did in Finland, for instance, were pretty much about that, finding possibilities for actually doing it by talking to institutions like the Finnish Telecom. These were the some pioneering telematic work using basically teleconferencing units and ISDN lines, telematic dreaming, telematic seance, that kind of works by Paul Sermon we did in Finland in the beginning of the 90s, and which then became a kind of classics like this. Anyway, so it was pretty much like a helping produce this work. But on the other hand, so it's hard to actually avoid the impression that the kind of idea of like a secondary creator or helping creator is pretty. It's also sometimes there. I've been working in such a way with some artists, which means that there's a very close collaboration, so that there are ideas. They come up with ideas or sketches, or sketches on video, some files in computer. They send me those files. I look at them, I comment on them, I criticize them, I send them back, they send me something again. So I wouldn't say that my role as a curator is very decisive in that kind of works, but it definitely has some kind of a role in the final outcome of the work. And I think that I noticed that I have been moving more and more towards this direction. I also feel strongly that the role of the curator on the field of like media art should not just be somebody selecting work, pre-existing work that's already there. It's much more interesting and challenging to try to help people create new work. And I think this is pretty much the role I think that the Museum of Contemporary Art as an institution also should adapt, and is partly adapting also these days. Then of course it's most clearly visible on the field of like web art, where some museums have actually invested a lot on that. But I mean that like museums like Kiasma, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Helsinki, with which I've been working quite a lot, is pretty much even equipped for this active role. So they have very good production facilities at the museum, and these are made available for artists to create projects for the museum. So very good digital editing and image processing suites and things like that. I don't know if it's an answer. It's a very important and complex question, and I really think that it hasn't been raised often enough these days. So it one should talk much more about that. And I'm not quite sure if I have very clear ideas myself. So maybe I should try to write something about this problematics.
Well, I think collaboration is the key, because artists work collaboratively, and then the curator assumes a role in that when they're part of the process. So a lot of the problem arises when people come in and want a finished piece and put it out of context.
Yeah. And I think it's emphasized when you deal with work which deals with all these technological means. I mean that it's much more understandable when you are doing a painting. It's pretty much, unless you want to do a panorama, so that it's pretty much like, or a Sixtine Chapel or something. So then it's what you do alone. But I don't know. It seems to be that it's more natural to see it more like a collaborative action somehow, activity.
Actually, we're coming to the end, a little bit over the end.
Okay.
I'm going to give you kind of you think of yourself as a bridge between design and media?
Sorry?
Your interest in media, media arts and design, do you consider yourself a kind of a bridge?
Good question. I would say that, as you can see very clearly, hopefully from my presentation as well. So I'm not a sort of like a traditional curator person or critic. So in the sense that working with media art has always been just I mean it's important, but it's one aspect of my work. Much of my work, realized work, is basically outside that field. So like in the narrow sense. And I think that questions around I can answer to your question from a couple of points of view. So first of all, I think there are issues that have been very important for me, which bridge really fields like design and media art. For instance, this whole question about the interfaces, the nature of the interface. How do we communicate with these devices? What's our relationship to each? What kind of balance are we trying to create between these things? I think it's a kind of question which is important both in the art context and in the context of designing other kinds of media experiences. So it's something we encounter in daily lives, which is pretty much something which has to do with like games culture these days, which is so powerful, getting more and more powerful. And in some other aspect, it's also naturally something that artists are dealing with. So I think in that sense, is probably bridges. My interest pretty much bridge, as you suggest, so bridge these two fields or approaches. Also, I've been very interested in always in popular cultural forms. I must say that I don't feel, and I say it frankly, I don't feel pretty much affinity with sort of like old style high culture. You know, like I don't feel I belong to the world of like classical high culture, even though of course it's important to know about that. I understand much more the logic of this new popular media culture. This is, frankly, this is the way I feel about it. When I was young, I played rock and roll in a group that got a recording contract, and we were playing in tours, and I was dealing much with comic art, comic strips. When I was young, I did even a book about theory, some kind of theories about comic, analyzing like graphic art, comic strips. And when I was a young student of art history, I produced actually my very first published sort of like scientific work, which is was focused on pop art, looking at the transformation process in Roy Lichtenstein's early 60s work from those from the comic strip frames that he used as a background for his comics paintings from a semiotic point of view. And this got published in a scientific kind of magazine, journal in early 80s, and it's #1 in my official list of publications. So, sorry? Which journal? No, that was actually in Finnish at that point. So it was a long time ago. I was a young, ambitious student who was very proud of having my work published. So, but anyway, just to give an idea that I was always very interested in the interconnections between popular culture, cultural forms, and then what was also happening on the field of art. So it was at that point, it was very natural for me to be very interested in like things like pop art at that point. I had a great professor who unfortunately is dead now. He was one of the best students of Cambridge, and he gave me a lot about field of like semiotic analysis of visual culture. It was pretty much a theoretical, strong influence on me at that point.